Tianjin Harbor, autumn 1941. The water smells of salt and coal smoke and something harder to name, the particular quality of an ending. A man is standing at the end of the dock with a boarding pass in his hand. The ship is loading. Families are moving up the gangway. Missionaries, diplomats, anyone with enough sense or enough fear to read what the Japanese military advance into northern China is about to become. The man has his name on the list. He has the boarding pass. He is 43 days away from his 40th birthday. His wife is already in Canada. 3 daughters, the youngest barely 2 months old when Florence left. He has not held any of them in nearly a year. He looks at the boarding pass. Then he looks at a young couple on the dock beside him. Newly arrived missionaries. No experience of what is coming. With a baby in arms and nowhere to go if the Japanese take the city. He folds the boarding pass. He hands it to the young husband. He steps back from the gangway. His name is Henry Liddell, and in the 9 years that remain of his life, he will never see Florence again. To understand why a man gives away the only door out of what is coming, you have to start in Tientsin, 1902. Not Paris, not Edinburgh, not any of the places the world would eventually know him from. You have to start in a Chinese city, in a stone mission compound, in the home of James and Mary Liddell, Scottish missionaries who had given their own lives to a continent and expected nothing back. Eric was born there, the second of their children, on January 16, 1902. He grew up between 2 worlds. The Scottish boarding school they sent him to in London, and the Chinese streets and compound courtyards, where the world was wider and less certain than any classroom. His father James was quiet in the way that deep people are quiet. He did not perform his faith. He simply lived inside it, the way other men live inside their skin, without thinking about it, because there was nothing else to be inside. His mother Mary prayed for the people of Tientsin the way she breathed, not out of obligation, out of reflex. Eric absorbed this before he had language for it. What he did have language for, quite early, was running. He was fast the way some people are musical, not trained into it, but simply born already arriving. By the time he reached Edinburgh University, there was no one in Scotland who could stay with him on the track, and eventually no one in Britain. In 1923, he was selected for the British Olympic team headed to Paris. The 100 meters, his event, the one everybody knew he would win. Then the schedule was published. The 100 meters heats were set for a Sunday. Eric Liddell would not compete on a Sunday. It wasn't a rule he had decided to follow. It was a conviction so settled in him that breaking it would have been like breaking something structural. A beam, not a preference. He withdrew from the 100 meters 6 months before the games began. There were no dramatic scenes, no public speech, no protest. He simply withdrew and applied himself to the 400 meters, a distance he had almost never run competitively. He won, not narrowly. He won with a world record, 47.6 seconds, and stood on the podium in Paris with the kind of face that people in the crowd could not quite explain to themselves afterward. Not triumphant, exactly, more like settled. Like a man who has already decided the thing that matters, and everything else is just weather. 1 year later, he was back in China. Not visiting, moving back. Taking a position as a teacher and evangelist in Tientsin, in the mission compound where he had been born. In the streets and river towns of Hebei province where his father had spent his life. The world wanted him for endorsements, for speaking tours, for sporting associations that would have been glad to have his name on their letterhead. He went back to China instead, to teach chemistry to teenagers who could not always afford the books. This is the detail that matters. He did not go to China because he had given up his gift. He went because the gift was never the point. The point had been there since James and Mary Liddell prayed in their compound house, since the Sunday conviction had taken shape in his chest at 17, since he ran not to become famous, but because something in him moved naturally toward the line, and he had long ago learned to give what he had back to whatever had given it. In 1932, he met Florence Mackenzie. She was from Toronto. Her family were people of the church, steady and unhurried in their faith the way the Great Lakes are patient, vast and reliable and cold in the right seasons. She had come to China as a missionary herself, young and certain in the way the young sometimes are, and she had not been disappointed. She met Eric at a mission gathering, and what she saw in him was not the Olympic runner the news accounts described. She saw a man who listened when you spoke, who laughed in a way that didn't require an audience, who seemed to have made his peace with something, though she couldn't name what, and who moved through the uncertainties of mission life without the anxious scanning she noticed in others. They married in 1934. They had 3 daughters, Patricia first, then Heather, and then Maureen, born in the year everything changed. By 1941, the Japanese expansion into China had made the interior provinces impossible. Florence was pregnant with Maureen when they made the decision to send her home to Canada with the older girls. The plan was that Eric would follow after wrapping up his work. He would be on the next ship. Except there was a young couple on the dock with nowhere to go. The next ship that could have taken him never came. The Japanese army entered Tientsin. In March of 1943, all foreign nationals, missionaries, business people, teachers, were ordered into internment. They were taken by train to Weixian, a walled compound in Shandong province that the occupying forces had converted from a Presbyterian mission school into a camp. 1,800 people, cramped dormitories, 1 pail of water per day, coal dust on every surface, and a perimeter of electrified barbed wire that hummed at night when the wind was wrong. Eric was assigned to Block 23. He unpacked his few belongings, located the camp chapel, and began teaching science to the children the following morning. This is the thing about Weixian that requires explanation, because it sounds like hagiography and it isn't. The camp was genuinely terrible. People died of disease. Rations were insufficient. The guards enforced the rules with a randomness that was its own kind of cruelty, lenient 1 week, brutal the next, so that the prisoners could never calibrate what was safe. There was a man in Block 23 named Stuart Ferrier, a 24-year-old British civilian who had been working for a trading company in Shanghai. He had a talent for languages and a reservoir of bitterness that had been building since the ship that took his family home had sailed without him. Stuart watched Eric move through the camp. The organized games in the courtyard, the tutoring sessions, the quiet conversations outside the infirmary, and it infuriated him in a way he could not quite account for. "How does he do it?" Stuart asked an older internee one afternoon. "How does he act as though none of this is happening?" The older man looked at him steadily. "He doesn't act that way," he said. "He knows exactly what's happening. He just decided something a long time ago." What Stuart did not know, what almost no one in the camp knew, was what Eric had decided about Sundays 20 years before any of this. And now in Weixian the children were coming to him on Sunday afternoons with nowhere to go and nothing to do and too much angry energy. And they were fighting. Small fights, then larger ones. Children with nothing to look forward to and no way to spend the hours. Eric organized Sunday afternoon sports. For a man who had walked away from a gold medal rather than compete on a Sunday, this was not a small thing. It was not a capitulation. What it was is harder to describe. The same conviction turned inside out by circumstance, expressing itself differently because the people in front of him needed something different than a rule could provide. He had given up Paris because his conscience was clear, and he could bear the cost to himself. He organized Sunday sports in Weixian because the children could not bear a cost that was not theirs to pay. There is a word for that kind of moral intelligence, but it is not a word that fits neatly into rules. It is closer to wisdom than to law. Stuart Ferrier watched this too. There is a particular afternoon in the late summer of 1944 that several Weixian survivors would mention later. A Japanese corporal had confiscated a handmade football from a group of younger boys. Not because it violated any regulation, simply because he could. Because some men in positions of small authority locate their power precisely in that kind of pointlessness. The boys came to Eric, furious and miserable. He listened. He went to the corporal, not in the stiff way of a formal complaint, not in the burning way of a man who had decided to make something of it. He spoke to him the way you speak to a person, directly, without deference but also without contempt. He asked for the ball back. The corporal refused. Eric thanked him for his time and left. That evening he organized a different game, with a rag stuffed into a makeshift sphere, and when the younger boys were busy, he sat next to Stuart Ferrier at the edge of the courtyard. "You wanted to shout at him," Stuart said. "It was not quite a question." "Yes," Eric said. "But you didn't." "I would have enjoyed it," Eric said, and there was something genuine in his voice, not the pious disclaimer Stuart had expected. "I would have enjoyed it, and it would have made everything worse. Not just for me, for everyone he'd decide to take it out on afterward." Stuart was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I don't understand how you don't hate them." Eric was quiet for a while, too. The kind of quiet that isn't the absence of thought, but the fullness of it. Then he said, "I think there's a difference between what they're doing and what they are. What they're doing is terrible. What they are is people who are going to have to carry what they've done. I feel something for them I didn't expect to feel." He wasn't performing when he said it. Stuart could tell the difference by then. And whatever moved through that quiet afternoon could not be dismissed or argued against, because it was not an argument. It was just a man who had made a decision about what he was willing to carry and what he was willing to release. By the winter of 1944, something had shifted in Stuart. He began helping with the children's activities on Sunday afternoons. He began stopping by the infirmary to sit with the patients Eric visited. He didn't have a name for what was happening to him. He wasn't certain he needed one yet. In November of 1944, Henry Liddell began having headaches that did not resolve. He continued teaching. He continued the Sunday games and the infirmary visits, and the evening chapel service in the cramped room that smelled of coal dust and bodies, and something, under all of it, that you could not name. He wrote letters to Florence that he was not certain would reach her. He described Maureen to himself, without knowing if the description matched the child who was growing up in Toronto without him. The diagnosis came in January of 1945. A brain tumor. The camp's limited medical resources could not treat it. He was told quietly and without ceremony, the way the camp's medical officer delivered all news, because there was no good way to do it and no time to find one. He thanked the doctor. Then he asked him to look in on an older Dutch woman in the East Dormitory, whose legs had been troubling her for a week. Stuart Ferrier heard about the diagnosis 2 days later. He went to find Eric and found him in the middle of a lesson, trigonometry, of all things, for a group of 15-year-olds who sat around him with the focused attention of children who have nothing else in the world to focus on and have chosen this. Stuart waited outside the door. He had intended to say something. He could not decide what. When the lesson ended and the students filed out, Eric looked up, saw him, and nodded once. The same nod he gave everyone. Stuart realized that whatever conversation this was had been happening quietly for months, since the Sunday afternoon with the confiscated ball, and Eric had known the whole time where it was going. "You're not afraid," Stuart said. It came out less like an accusation, and more like a statement of something he couldn't yet understand. "I didn't say that," Eric told him. "Then what?" "I've been afraid of plenty of things," Eric said. He was straightening the papers from the lesson, the careful, deliberate movements of a man who has learned to be present to small things. "I was afraid when Florence left. I was afraid the first time I stepped onto the 400-meter track in Paris, because I had almost never run it properly before. I was afraid the night before the race." "But you won," Stuart said. "I did, but that wasn't the thing." He set the papers down. "The night before the race, a man I didn't know put a piece of paper in my hand, a Bible verse. 'He that honors me I will honor.' I read it, and something settled in me. Not certainty about the race, certainty about something underneath the race. I can't give you a better word than that." Stuart was quiet. "Whatever is happening now," Eric said, "that something is still there, deeper than the camp, deeper than the diagnosis. I'm afraid, but the afraid part isn't the deepest part." On the morning of February 21, 1945, Henry Liddell died in the camp infirmary at Weishin. He was 43 years old. The last words the medical officer recorded were, "It's complete surrender." The camp did not stop for long. There was roll call regardless, and rations to collect, and the day's particular diminishments to navigate. But something moved through the compound quietly, from person to person. A teacher who had given his trigonometry lesson 3 days before dying of a brain tumor, a man who had given away the last evacuation boarding pass and never made a public thing of it, a runner who had refused the race that would have made him famous and gone back to China to teach chemistry to teenagers instead. The news reached Florence in Toronto 6 weeks later. She was sitting at the kitchen table when the telegram arrived. Her girls were in the other room. She read it once, set it down, read it again, and then sat with it for a long time before she went in to speak to her daughters. What she told people for the rest of her long life was that she had never understood the word surrender the way she understood it after Weixian. Not as losing, as something more like completion, as the final release of a hand that had been holding something beautiful for exactly the right amount of time. Stuart Ferrier was repatriated to Britain when the camp was liberated in August of 1945. He eventually made his way to Canada, to Toronto, where Florence Liddell was raising 3 daughters in a parish community on the east side of the city. He told her what he could about the last months. He told her about the Sunday games and the corporal and the trigonometry lesson and the afternoon in the courtyard. She recognized every piece of it. She said that was just Eric. Stuart spent the next 30 years working with youth in the church. He told the story of that courtyard afternoon. The rag ball, the refused complaint, the thing Eric had said about the difference between what a person is doing and what they are, more times than he could count. It wasn't a speech. It was just a thing a man had said, sitting at the edge of a courtyard in a Japanese internment camp, that turned out to be true enough to build a life on. In 1981, a film opened in theaters across Canada about a Scottish runner who refused to compete on Sunday at the 1924 Paris Olympics. Audiences filed out of cinemas in the winter cold having learned the name Eric Liddell, some for the first time. The film doesn't tell you what happened after Paris. It doesn't tell you about Weixian, or the boarding pass, or the ball, or the trigonometry lesson, or the 2 final words. Those parts are for us. What kept Eric Liddell burning through the internment camp and an entire life of quiet, unrecorded service? 5 things, and none of them were complicated. First, formation before crisis. The Sunday conviction was not made in Paris under pressure. It was made in Edinburgh years earlier, in a student's room, before anyone was watching. The depth of what sustained him in Weixian was the depth of something that had been growing since childhood. In mission compounds and prayer meetings, and a father who did not perform his faith because there was nothing to perform it for. Second, surrender as a practice, not a moment. This is the word that sounds like weakness and turns out to be the thing that held him upright. Not surrender to the Japanese, surrender of the outcome, the race, the boarding pass, the diagnosis, the final page. He had been practicing this since the moment he stepped back from the Paris 100 meters. By Weixian, it was a reflex, the fist he had already learned to open, again and again long before anyone asked him to. Third, presence to small things. The trigonometry lesson 3 days before he died, the visit to the Dutch woman with the troubling legs, the Sunday games for children with nowhere to go. He was never waiting for the large moment that would make things matter. The small moment was already it, already the whole thing. Fourth, the distinction that carries life. What someone is doing is not the same as what they are. He taught this in a courtyard with a confiscated ball and a rag sewn into a sphere. A person who can hold that distinction, who can be clear-eyed about cruelty without losing his sense of the humanity underneath it, is a person who does not become what he hates. That kept Stuart Ferrier from becoming what bitterness would have made of him. It may have saved more than one person in that camp in ways that were never recorded. Fifth, completion as a category distinct from achievement. Eric did not finish the race by any outward measure. He died in an internment camp at 43, separated from his family, with a brain tumor and a ragball football, and a classroom of teenagers still working through trigonometry. By every external account, unfinished. But the word the medical officer recorded was surrender, not defeat. Florence heard it as completion. Stuart heard it as a foundation. A life is not measured only in what it achieves. It is measured also in what it transmits, what it deposits in the people who were watching, who carry it forward into places the original life never reached. There is someone in your life whose cost to you is real. Maybe they are holding a door closed. Maybe they cost you more than that. You have kept the tally, and the tally is accurate, and the case is as solid as you have made it. Henry Liddell had a case. The people who put him in Waitian cost him Florence, cost him Maureen's first words, and Patricia's school performances, and 3 years of ordinary Tuesdays that were never ordinary, because they were with his family and now they were not. His case was airtight. He chose to see something underneath the case that the case itself could not account for. Not because he was unable to feel the injury. He felt it, but he had learned in a courtyard in Shandong province that the injured part is not the deepest part. What that costs you is real. What you receive in return is not yours to manufacture. You supply the open hand. The rest comes from somewhere underneath the case. If that is the thing you are holding today, comment below with its complete surrender. Not because you are finished, not because it is easy, but because you are willing to begin. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next witness in this series. Next time, we follow a young Hungarian doctor into a Soviet prison hospital in the 1950s, where he was given a choice between his career and of his faith, and what he chose became the foundation of a movement that reached millions. That's next, right here on Gathering of Souls.